Walter Greer was 75 and had spent 4 decades as a structural ironworker. Delores was 73 and had spent 30 years designing and painting theatrical sets. They had been married for 47 years and had met at a county fair, which sounds like a coincidence until you understand that neither of them believed in coincidences. That spring, they paid $600 for the old Coppervale Fairground on Route 11. The fairground had been padlocked since 1983. The carousel pavilion had collapsed. The mayor called it an eyesore and an insurance problem and said she was glad someone was taking it off the county's hands. Walt read the paper and told Delores the ironwork on the main gate was still sound. Delores said she had noticed. What they found beneath the collapsed carousel pavilion had been waiting 41 years for someone to come back. 13 months later, the fairground opened for the first time since 1983. Every ticket was gone in 4 hours. But I need to take you back to the beginning. The Coppervale Fairground sat on 11 acres at the edge of town on Route 11, behind a padlocked iron gate that had not been opened since the last day of the 1983 Harlan County Fair. That was the year the County Fair Commission had run out of operating funds and voted to suspend operations temporarily, which was the kind of temporary that becomes permanent when nobody finds a way to make it otherwise. 41 years of temporary. The county had tried to sell the property 3 times in the intervening decades. The first attempt, in 1997, had produced 1 inquiry that came to nothing. The second attempt, in 2009, had been complicated by a dispute over the status of the improvements on the property, which is to say, the rides and the structures, which the county assessor had classified as fixtures, but which a prospective buyer's lawyer had argued were personal property subject to separate disposition. The dispute had outlasted the buyer's interest. The third attempt was the auction Walt and Delores Greer attended on a Wednesday morning in April, which produced no other bidders and a final price of $600. The auctioneer did not appear surprised by the outcome. He appeared to have arranged his expectations accordingly some time before the auction began. Walt had been to the property twice before the auction. The first time he had stood at the padlocked gate and looked through the iron bars at the grounds beyond. The second time he had brought a flashlight and looked more carefully. He had not gone inside because the gate was still county property, and he was not the kind of man who went inside locked gates he did not own. But he had looked. He had looked at the gate itself, which was a substantial iron structure, decorative in the fairground tradition with scroll elements along the top rail and the words Coppervale Fair worked into the center of the arch in iron letters. He had looked at the ironwork. It was sound. 41 years of weather and no maintenance, and the ironwork was sound because whoever had made it had known what they were making. He had told Delores this on the drive home. She had been quiet for a moment, and then asked if he had seen the carousel pavilion. He said the roof had come down on the east side. She asked if the carousel was still there. He said he could not see it from the gate. She said she thought they should find out. Walt was the kind of man who, when his wife said she thought they should find out, began making arrangements to find out. He had been married to Delores for 47 years and had never found a situation in which this approach failed him. They had met at the Harlan County Fair in 1971. Walt was 22 and working the summer with a ride maintenance crew, the kind of seasonal ironwork that paid well and moved every few weeks. Delores was 20 and had been hired to paint backdrops for the sign booth and the game stalls, the decorative scenery that gave a fair its visual character. She was working on a 12-foot panel depicting a mountain landscape with a sunset, and Walt had walked past 3 times before stopping to watch her paint. He had stopped because the painting was good in a way he had not expected to find on a fairground backdrop, and also because of other things he had been less equipped at 22 to name precisely. She had noticed him watching. She had said, without looking away from the panel, that if he was going to stand there, he could at least hand her the wide brush from the bucket to her left. He had handed her the brush. They had been married 14 months later, Neither of them had ever returned to a county fair as paying customers because they had both worked enough fairs to understand the difference between being in it and watching it. In the auction room on the Wednesday in April, with the gavel not yet down, Walt sat with his arms folded, and Delores sat beside him with her sketchbook open on her knee, a habit she had developed decades ago of sketching whatever space she was in as a way of understanding it. She had been sketching the auction room during the earlier lots. When the Coppervale Fairground lot came up, she closed the sketchbook and folded her hands on top of it. The auctioneer opened at 2,000. Nobody moved. He dropped to 1,500. Nobody moved. He dropped to 1,000. A man near the front shifted in his seat in a way that suggested he was considering something. Then he stopped shifting, and the room went back to its original stillness. Walt raised his hand at 600. The auctioneer looked at him the way auctioneers look at the person who finally resolves a lot that has been going nowhere, with a particular professional gratitude that has nothing to do with the price. The gavel came down. Delores opened her sketchbook again. She turned to a new page and drew a rectangle, and inside the rectangle she drew a gate arch with the words Coppervale Fair in the arch. She drew it from memory because she had seen the gate in the photographs Walt had described, and also because she had driven past that gate herself more than once in their years in Coppervale, and it had always looked to her like a gate that was meant to be opened. She had not told Walt that she had driven past it. She did not need to tell him everything she had already decided before she decided it. Walt watched her draw and did not say anything. He recognized what she was doing. He had been watching her do it for 47 years. The drive to Route 11 took 8 minutes. Walt had the padlock key the county had given him at the close of the auction, and he used it at the gate, and the padlock opened with the specific resistance of a mechanism that has been locked for a very long time and has forgotten what open feels like. The gate itself swung inward on iron hinges that Walt checked with both hands, testing the articulation and the load on the hinge pins, the specific assessment of a man who has been doing structural ironwork for 4 decades. The hinges were stiff from oxidation, but sound. He said so. Delores had already walked through the gate. The fairground beyond was 11 acres of tall grass and scrub growth. The paths and the layout of the ground still legible beneath 41 years of nature's indifference. The main midway ran from the gate straight back through the center of the property, wide enough to have accommodated the shoulder-to-shoulder crowd of a county fair at its peak. On either side of the midway, the structures were in varying states. Some of the game stalls had collapsed entirely, their lumber gray and fallen flat to the ground. One of them had a tree growing through its middle, a scrub elm about 15 feet tall that had found the gap in the roof and taken full advantage of the 41 years it had been given. The food concession building at the midpoint of the midway was standing, but its roof had buckled in the center from accumulated ice load over too many winters without heat. The grandstand at the far end of the midway was the largest structure and the most intact, its steel frame visible above the scrub where the wooden cladding had fallen away on 3 sides. The scrub on the midway itself had grown in at the edges, narrowing the original 12-foot width to something closer to 6 or 8 feet in places, but the center of the path was still packed gravel under the grass, the decades of foot traffic having compacted the ground enough that the vegetation had never fully reclaimed it. You could still read where the crowds had walked. Walt noted this. It told him something about how the ground would respond to restoration, and at the center of the property, offset from the midway on a slight rise, the carousel pavilion. The pavilion's roof had come down on the east side exactly as Walt had seen from the gate. The east section of the roof had failed at the peak and fallen inward, bringing part of the decorative fascia with it, the collapsed section now a heap of weathered timber and old shingles. The west section of the roof was intact, giving the structure a tilted appearance, as if the pavilion had leaned into a wind and stayed that way. But the carousel platform beneath the tilted roof was visible through the open east side, and what was on it was still there. Walt and Delores stood at the edge of the collapsed east section and looked at the carousel. It was a classic platform carousel, wooden platform, center column, sweep arms. The figures were gone, removed, or fallen, but the sweep arms were still in place and the platform was intact. More than intact. The platform was solid. Walt walked out onto it, testing each board with his weight before committing, and found that the platform was sound across its full diameter, which he measured by walking it. He said the platform was good. Delores was not looking at the platform. She was looking at a low brick structure at the base of the center column, roughly 4 feet square and 3 feet high, mortared brick with a heavy wooden lid fitted flush with the mortar surface. The lid was not rotted. The wood was in good condition, which was unusual for something that had been exposed to 40 years of weather. She crouched beside it and ran her hand along the surface. The wood was dry and dense, and the edges of the lid were set into the top course of brickwork with a precision that was not casual construction. She said this was built to keep something in. Walt came to look. He crouched beside her and examined the lid and the mortared edges. He said the brick was solid and the lid was fitted to keep water and air out, and that whoever had done the fitting had done it correctly. She said that sounded like someone who cared a great deal about what was inside. He pulled at the lid edge with both hands. It did not move. He went to his truck for a pry bar. It took 20 minutes. The lid had been seated in the brick for 41 years, and it released in stages with the specific sounds of a seal giving way to persistence rather than force. When it finally came free and Walt lifted it clear, a dry, warm air came from below, not the cold of the Callaway or the Stillwater Cedar Room, but the dry warmth of a sealed space that has been protected from the outside world with considerable care. Inside the brick housing, cushioned in what had once been horse blankets, now aged to a dense gray felt, was a pipe organ console. It was a Wurlitzer Fairground organ. Model 157, as Walt would learn later from the manufacturer's plate mounted on the inside face of the housing. Built in 1921. The console was intact. The ivory keys were yellowed but present. The stop tabs along the top of the keyboard were set in their last position from 1983, which was 41 years ago, which was the last time anyone had played it. Delores looked at the organ for a long time without speaking. Then she said she thought they needed to find out if it still worked. Walt said he thought so too. He said the ironwork first. She said, of course, the ironwork first. They stood in the carousel pavilion in the April light coming through the open east side of the collapsed roof, and the fairground was 41 years of silence around them, and neither of them was thinking about the silence because they were both already thinking about what came after it. Mayor Eunice Pratt had been mayor of Coppervale for 9 years and had in that time inherited a set of civic problems she had not created and was working steadily through. The fairground on Route 11 was one of them, having sat on the county's liability register for decades as an unresolved asset that nobody wanted and everyone agreed was an embarrassment. She had been genuinely relieved when the auction produced a buyer, even at $600, and she had said so directly to the Coppervale Courier in the week after the auction. She said she respected the Greers as long-time Coppervale residents and wished them well with the property. She said the county was glad to see the liability transferred to private hands. She said she hoped they understood the scope of what they had taken on. She meant it constructively. She was a practical woman, and her statement was a practical one. It was not unkind. It was the statement of someone who had looked at the fairground from the outside for 9 years and understood it as a liability because that was what the county's paperwork said it was. Marcus called from Portland the evening the Courier ran the story. He was their son, 44 years old, a graphic designer who had grown up in Coppervale and moved to Portland 15 years ago and had been keeping a comfortable distance from small-town decisions ever since. He asked his father if they had spoken to a structural engineer. He asked if they had any sense of what 11 acres of deferred maintenance looked like in restoration costs. He asked what his mother was planning to do with the scenic design background on a property that had not operated since he was 3 years old. Walt told him Delores was planning to paint the carousel panels. There was a pause. Marcus asked what carousel panels, since he had heard the fairground structures were collapsed. Walt said the carousel platform was sound, and the carousel pavilion was a roof repair, and the carousel itself needed its figures and its panels restored, and that his mother was planning to do that. Marcus said he was going to need some time to think about this. Walt said Marcus could take all the time he needed, and that the work was going to proceed regardless. Delores got on the phone and told Marcus she loved him, and that if he could come out in late summer, she thought he would understand what they were doing better than he could from Portland. Marcus said he would think about it. Delores said she hoped he would. She went back to her sketchbook after the call. She opened to a new page and began drawing the carousel, not as it was, but as it had been, working from a photograph she had found at the Coppervale Historical Society the previous week, a black and white image from the 1921 Harlan County Fair showing the carousel in its first season of operation, the figures visible and the panels painted with the scenes that the original owners had specified. She could not see the colors in the photograph, but she could see the composition and the subject matter and the style, and she knew how to read a black and white image for its color relationships, the way she had been reading them for 30 years of scenic work. She drew and Walt watched her draw, and neither of them said anything because there was nothing to say that the drawing was not already saying. The work began in the second week. Walt started with a complete structural assessment of the property, which he conducted himself with a notebook and a probe and the particular reading ability of a man who has been inside structural systems for 40 years. He went through every standing structure on the 11 acres in order of priority, from the carousel pavilion, which was the center of everything, outward through the food concession building and the grandstand and the game stalls and the perimeter fence. His assessment took 3 days and produced a notebook with 40 pages of entries. Some of the entries were good news. The carousel pavilion west section was structurally sound. The grandstand steel frame was in better condition than its exterior appearance suggested. The paint was gone and the surface rust was deep in places, but the section integrity was intact, and Walt knew the difference between surface rust and structural compromise because it was one of the first things he had learned in his career, and he had never forgotten it. The perimeter iron fence was corroded in places, but fundamentally intact. The main gate ironwork he had already assessed as sound. Some of the entries were a larger project. The food concession roof needed full replacement. The game stall structures were beyond economical repair and should be removed to their footings and rebuilt. The collapsed east section of the carousel pavilion required new framing and sheathing before the roof could be addressed. He sat with his notebook on the carousel platform that first Thursday evening and wrote a sequenced work plan. Carousel pavilion roof repair. First because everything else depended on getting a proper roof over the organ. Then the perimeter fence. Then the main gate rehabilitation, which he was looking forward to. Then the grandstand. He was a structural ironworker, and he had not been practicing his trade for 4 years, since his retirement, and his hands knew what they were missing. He started on the carousel pavilion east section the following Monday with a rented scissor lift and materials he had staged in the gravel lot just inside the gate. The work was familiar and good. He worked at his pace, which was the pace of someone who no longer needed to prove anything to anyone and was doing the work for its own sake, which is the best pace for any work that deserves to be done well. Delores had her own project running parallel. She had set up her painting materials on a workbench Walt had built along the pavilion's west interior wall, a long flat surface at the right height for panel work, with her reference photographs pinned above it and her color studies taped beside them. She worked on one panel at a time, preparing the surface first with the care of someone who has learned that scenic painting done in haste fails in the specific way of paint that has not bonded correctly with what is beneath it. She sized each panel with a primer coat and let it cure fully before touching it with color. She worked in the mornings when the light coming through the pavilion opening was best, the flat, even light of the midday hours. In the afternoons, she prepared the next panel's surface and studied her reference and mixed color studies on scrapboard. She was working on the Fairgate panel first, the 1921 gate in its original year, the arch with the Coppervale Fair lettering and the crowd entering beneath it in their early 20s clothes. She had found 2 additional photographs of the Historical Society, beyond the main image, both showing details of the gate in different years, and the combination of the 3 images gave her a reliable picture of what the lettering had looked like and what the ironwork had looked like before 41 years of weather had changed it. She had not yet told Walt about the panel plan in full. Not because she was hiding it from him, but because she was not ready to say it out loud yet, and in 47 years of marriage, Walt had learned to read the difference. She called him on the 2nd week and described what was in the brick housing beneath the carousel center column. There was a silence on his end. Then he asked her to describe the housing construction again. She described it. He said the housing had been built specifically to preserve the organ through periods when the fairground was not operating. He said this was done occasionally by fairground operators who were proud of their instruments and intended to return to them. He said it was not common because it required a level of care that not everyone was willing to take. He said if the housing had been done correctly, the organ might be in playable condition. Delores asked if he could come and look at it. Arnold Fenn drove from Grand Rapids on a Friday in the 3rd week, a compact man of 71 with a black bag that he carried the way doctors carry medical bags, with the authority of a person who has spent decades arriving at problems that nobody else can solve. He went straight to the carousel pavilion without being shown the way, having oriented himself from the gate, and spent 2 hours with the organ before he spoke. He said it was the finest example of a preserved Wurlitzer 157 he had ever encountered outside of a museum. He said the original owner had done everything correctly. He said the bellows would need work, and 2 of the reed chambers had minor damage from humidity that had found a way in at some point, but that the rest of the mechanism was in remarkable condition for its age. He said he thought it could be made to play again. Delores sat on the carousel platform while he said this and looked at the console. She said she would like very much to hear it play. Arnold said he would come back when she was ready for him. She said she thought they would be ready in about 4 months. He said he would be there. When he had gone, Delores went to the sketchbook. She opened it to a double-spread page and began drawing the carousel panels, all 12 of them, in sequence around the circular spread. Each panel a scene from the 1921 fair as she had reconstructed it, from the Historical Society photograph, and from the Wurlitzer organization's records, which had included a specification sheet for the Coppervale instrument that described the original panel subjects. The scenes were the fair gate in its first year, the midway at noon, the grandstand with a crowd, a family at the ring toss, a child on the carousel, the sunset over the fairground hill. She drew them all, small and specific, as her working reference for what she was going to paint on the restored panels. She had not yet told Walt about the panel plan. Not because she was hiding it from him, but because she was not ready to say it out loud yet, and in 47 years of marriage, Walt had learned to read the difference. The first small victory came in the 4th week. Walt had reframed the entire east section of the carousel pavilion roof and was beginning to sheath it. He had worked through it systematically, the new framing sitting clean and true on the old wall plates, the geometry of the roof returning to its original form as the framing filled in. Standing on the scissor lift at the peak of the new framing on a Thursday afternoon, looking down at the carousel platform with its sealed brick housing and the intact west section of the roof beside him and the new east framing around him, he had a feeling he recognized from certain jobs in his ironwork career, the feeling of a structure that is going to be right, not just adequate. Right, he came down and told Delores. She was sitting on the carousel platform with her sketchbook and her reference photographs from the Historical Society, working on the panel drawings. She looked up and said she was glad to hear it. He asked what she was drawing. She told him about the panels. He sat down beside her on the platform and she showed him the double-spread drawing with all 12 scenes. He looked at it for a long time. He pointed at the panel showing the child on the carousel and asked if she was going to paint that one last. She said she had not decided the order yet. He said he thought she should paint it last. She said she thought she probably agreed. They sat on the carousel platform in the afternoon light coming through the half-sheathed roof, and the panels were in the sketchbook between them, and the organ was in its brick housing at the center column. And neither of them said anything for a while because the work was going to do its own talking, and they both understood that. Hector Solis had been painting signs in Coppervale for 35 years before his shop closed in 2019. He was 68 now and lived 4 blocks from the fairground property and had been watching the activity on Route 11 since the auction with the particular attention of a man whose trade was the decorative art of public spaces and who had never quite made his peace with retirement. He drove past the gate twice a week, sometimes 3 times. He pulled in on a Saturday in the 5th week. Walt was on the scissor lift, finishing the east roof sheathing. Delores was on the carousel platform, painting the first of her 12 panels, working from her sketchbook reference and a color study she had prepared on the paper, the fair gate in its first year, the wrought iron arch and the hand-lettered sign, and the people entering in their 1921 clothes. Hector stood at the edge of the pavilion and watched her paint for a while. Then he said she was painting the 1921 fair from the Historical Society photograph. Delores said yes without looking away from the panel. He said he had a copy of that photograph at home. He said he had another photograph she had probably not found from the 1938 fair, which showed the painted panels from that era and gave a better sense of the original color palette because the 38 photograph had been taken in better light. Delores set her brush down and looked at him. She said she would very much like to see the 1938 photograph. Hector said he would bring it Monday. He was there Monday with the photograph and 2 cans of the best outdoor varnish available in Coppervale and a set of his own brushes that he said were better for fine detail work than what she was using. He stayed 4 hours and helped mix color and sand the surface of the second panel for priming. He was back Wednesday and the Wednesday after that, and by the 3rd week of his involvement, Hector had taken informal responsibility for the panel preparation and varnishing work, which freed Delores to focus on the painting itself. They worked together in the carousel pavilion with the companionable silence of 2 people who understand paint and surface and do not need to explain themselves to each other. Walt watched this from the scissor lift and from the fence sections and was glad of it, because Delores' work on the panels was better when Hector was there, not because Hector told her anything she did not know, but because the presence of someone who understood what she was doing gave her a different quality of focus. If you have made it this far into Walt and Delores' story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. Marcus came in late August. He had called in July to say he was coming and had given a specific date rather than a range, which Walt took as a sign that his son had made a decision of some kind and was arriving to confirm it. Marcus was like that. He made decisions internally and arrived with them finished. He drove up from Portland, a 2-day drive, and arrived on a Friday evening when the light on the fairground was warm and long. The kind of August evening light that makes everything look more finished than it is. Walt and Delores were still on the property when he arrived, and he parked outside the gate and walked in and stood in the midway. He had been 3 years old at the last Harlan County Fair. He had no memory of it. What he was looking at was a place he had no memory of, and that was also in some way entirely familiar, the way places from early childhood are sometimes recognized without being remembered. He walked the midway slowly. The game stall footings were cleared and the new stall structures were framed and partly sided. Walt's work. The food concession building had its new roof on, the fresh shingles bright above the old walls. The grandstand at the far end of the midway had been cleared of scrub and its steel frame repointed, and the new wooden cladding was going up on the south and east faces. The perimeter fence was fully rehabilitated, the ironwork cleaned and primed and painted in the dark green that had been the original color, which Walt had identified from a paint chip he had found under a gate hinge. Marcus walked to the carousel pavilion. The roof was complete. Both sections, east and west, fully sheathed and properly weathered with new standing seam metal that Walt had formed himself. The pavilion had its original outline back. Inside the pavilion, 11 of the 12 carousel panels were painted and varnished and mounted in their places around the platform. The 12th panel position was visible, its panel not yet hung, the space it would occupy open. The 11 mounted panels showed the 1921 Harlan County Fair as Delores had reconstructed it from the photograph in the 38 image and 3 decades of scenic painting. The fair gate in its first year, the midway at noon, the grandstand crowd, the ring toss family, the sunset over the hill. Each scene was painted in the palette of the original, warm and specific, with the specific quality of scenic work done by someone who has spent 30 years understanding how paint reads at a distance and up close and in changing light. Marcus stood in the pavilion and looked at the panels for a long time. He asked where the 12th panel was. Delores came in from outside, where she had been talking to Hector, and said she was painting it last, which was his father's idea. Marcus looked at the space for the 12th panel, and then at the panels that were there, and then at his mother. He said he owed them an apology. Delores said she accepted it. Walt came in from the grandstand side and said Marcus did not owe them anything, that he had told them the truth as he saw it from 3 states away, and that was what they had raised him to do. Marcus said that was a generous way to put it. Walt said it was an accurate way to put it. Marcus asked if he could help with anything while he was there. Walt said the new game stall siding needed painting, and Hector was going to show him the technique Saturday morning if he was interested. Marcus said he was interested. He stayed 10 days. He helped Hector with the game stall siding and helped Walt with the grandstand cladding, and on the last morning of his visit, he watched Delores paint the 12th panel, the child on the carousel. The figure was small and specific, and painted from a detail Delores had found in the corner of the 1938 photograph. A child on the original carousel in a white dress, her arm extended toward someone outside the frame. Delores had painted her with the quality of light that comes through a revolving carousel canopy, shifting and warm. Marcus watched his mother paint the panel and did not speak until she was finished. Then he said it was the best thing he had seen in a long time. He said he meant that with the full weight of the word best and the full range of the things he had seen. Delores said she appreciated that and handed him the varnish brush and told him he could do the first coat since he was there. He did the first coat. Arnold Fenn came back in the first week of September as he had promised. He spent 2 days with the organ, opening the brick housing fully and working through the mechanism with the unhurried precision of a man who has been doing this his whole professional life and has found what he came to find. Walt built a temporary shelter around the open housing while Arnold worked, to keep the weather off. Delores brought coffee. On the second day, Arnold replaced the damaged reed chamber components with parts he had brought from his shop, and revoiced 3 of the stops that had gone flat and worked through the bellows with new leather. He worked until early afternoon. Then he asked if Walt and Delores would step back from the housing. They stepped back. Arnold sat at the console and adjusted his position on the bench the way he adjusted his position at every organ he had ever played. Slightly forward, weight on the balls of his feet, hands resting on the keys without pressing them. He sat like that for a moment. Then he played 3 notes, then a chord, then a phrase. The Wurlitzer 157 had a sound that was entirely specific to what it was, not like a church organ and not like a theater pipe organ, but like a fairground organ, which is to say warm and large and slightly intemperate, the kind of sound that is built to carry across an open field and land in the body rather than just the ears. It had a brightness in the upper registers and a warmth in the lower ones, and when Arnold played a full chord, the sound filled the carousel pavilion completely, bouncing off the 12 painted panels and the repaired roof and the iron pavilion posts, finding every corner of the space. It was the sound of something that had been made to be heard in exactly this kind of structure and was hearing itself properly for the first time in 41 years. After 41 years of silence, the sound of it in the carousel pavilion was enormous and immediate and entirely itself. Walt stood still with his hands in his pockets, and he was not a man who showed much on his face in moments that surprised him, and this moment surprised him, not the fact of the organ playing because Arnold had said it would play, but the specific quality of the sound, which was not what he had imagined when he had imagined it. It was more. It was the sound of the thing itself, and he had not known what the thing itself sounded like until it was sounding. Delores was crying before the first phrase was finished, and she was not someone who cried easily or often, but the sound of the Wurlitzer in the pavilion with the 12 panels around the carousel platform and the repaired roof above and the ironwork gates visible through the pavilion opening at the end of the midway was the specific thing that crossed the line she kept. Arnold played for 20 minutes. He played the repertoire that fairground organs were built to play, marches and waltzes and popular songs from the era of their manufacture. The music that had played at the Harlan County Fair in 1921 and 1938, and every fair year between, the music that had last sounded in this pavilion in 1983, and that was sounding again now because two people had paid $600 and asked the right questions and done the right work in the right order. Hector Solis had come to the property that day because he had heard Arnold was returning, and he sat on the carousel platform with his hands on his knees while Arnold played and did not say anything at all for a long time after the music stopped. The Coppervale Courier ran a story in the 10th week. The reporter was a woman named Gail Murdoch, who had been covering Coppervale for 12 years and had never had a story she had been more glad to write. She had been at the property the day Arnold played. She had heard the Wurlitzer. Her story ran on a Thursday morning with the headline, "Retired Couple. Restores Coppervale Fairground after 41 years. Sealed 1921. Organ plays again." The photographs included the panels, the organ, the repaired pavilion, and the ironwork gate. She had photographed Walt's hands on the gate ironwork, and Delores' hands on the panel she was varnishing, and the 2 pairs of leather work aprons hanging on their nail inside the pavilion, side by side, his from ironwork and hers from scenic painting. The story was picked up by the Regional Wire the same afternoon. A television crew from the Traverse City station drove down the following week. A journalist from a national architecture and preservation magazine called Gail to ask if she could connect them with the Greers. An organization called Fairground Heritage Preservation Trust called Walt directly. Mayor Eunice Pratt called the same week. She drove to the property on a Thursday morning and walked through the gate Walt held open for her. She walked the midway and the grandstand and the pavilion. She stood in front of the 12 panels for a long time. She asked Walt to explain what the organ was. He explained it. She listened carefully. She said she owed the Greers an acknowledgement. She said she had described their purchase publicly as a liability transfer and had used that framing specifically, and it had not been a generous framing, and she was aware of the difference between what she had said and what the situation had turned out to be. She said the county had held that property for 41 years and had not once asked what was under the carousel pavilion floor. Delores said she appreciated that. Eunice asked if there was anything the county could do in advance of the opening event. Walt said the Route 11 verge between the road and the gate needed clearing, which he had requested formally 6 weeks earlier, and which had not happened. Eunice said she would see to it before the end of the week. Walt said he appreciated that. She shook both their hands and walked back down the midway and through the gate and drove back to town. Walt watched her go. He said she had more grace than he had expected. Delores said she had always thought Eunice Pratt was a person who could be surprised into better behavior. Walt said that was a kind way to put it. She said it was accurate. The opening event for the restored Coppervale Fairground was held on a Saturday evening in late September, 41 years and 1 month after the last day of the 1983 Harlan County Fair. The event was a single evening, 3 hours, limited to 300 tickets. Walt and Delores had not expected the demand. The tickets sold out in 4 hours through an online system Marcus had set up from Portland and managed remotely, and 300 people came through the gate on the Saturday evening in weather that held dry and cool and perfect for late September. There were people in the crowd who had been to the last Harlan County Fair in 1983 as children. Walt could identify them by the way they walked the midway. They walked it slowly, and they looked at the game stalls and the food concession and the grandstand with a particular expression, the expression of people who are comparing what they are seeing to something they cannot quite access, a memory that is mostly feeling rather than image. Several of them stopped to tell Walt or Delores where they had been standing the last time they were here. One woman told Delores she had ridden this carousel in 1982. She was in her 50s now. She stood in the pavilion and looked at the 12 panels and said the paintings looked exactly right, which was what she'd hoped to find out and had not been certain she would. The midway was lit. The grandstand was open. The game stalls were operating, Hector running the ring toss with the particular authority of a man who has been painting signs for county fairs his whole life and understands the register. The food concession was open with a menu Delores had designed and Marcus had helped organize. And in the carousel pavilion, Arnold Fenn played the Wurlitzer 157. The sound carried across the grounds the way it was built to, warm and large and slightly intemperate, landing in the body rather than just the ears, the fairground music that the fair had been playing since 1921. People stopped walking when they first heard it. Some of them stood in the midway and simply listened for a moment before moving toward the pavilion. Some of them stayed in the pavilion for the full evening, sitting on the platform edge with their backs to the carousel panels, listening. Marcus was there. He had flown in from Portland for the weekend. He worked the gate for the first hour and then walked the midway and ended up in the carousel pavilion where he stayed for the rest of the evening. He sat on the platform with his back against the 12th panel. The child on the carousel, the panel he had helped varnish. Walt and Delores moved through the evening separately and together, the way they moved through everything, each attending to their specific competence and arriving at the same place when the work of an hour was done. At the end of the evening, when the last guests had gone and the midway lights were off and Arnold had closed the organ housing and said his good night, Walt and Delores stood together in the carousel pavilion in the quiet. Their aprons were on their nail on the pavilion post behind them, side by side. His from ironwork and hers from scenic painting, both of them worn through the full 13 months of the restoration, both shaped to the specific bodies that had worn them. Walt put his hand on the brick housing at the base of the center column. Delores put her hand on the panel beside her, the first one she had painted, the fair gate in its first year. He said he thought they had done something that would last. She said she had always intended it to last. He said he knew she had. She said she knew he knew. They stood in the carousel pavilion in the quiet after the music, with the 12 panels around them and the ironwork gate visible at the far end of the dark midway and the Harlan County night sky above the repaired roof, and it was exactly the kind of thing that happens when two people who met at a fair 47 years ago decide that the thing that brought them together is worth bringing back. I want to know how Walt and Delores' story sat with you. Leave it in the comments below. Whatever you felt when Arnold Fenn played the Wurlitzer, or when Delores painted the 12th panel, belongs there, and I want to read it. Tell me where you are watching from today. This channel finds people in more places than I expect, and every location in the comments is a reminder of that. And I want to ask you something that Walt and Delores keep asking me. Is there something from the beginning of your life, some place or some sound or something that belonged to a time you cannot quite get back to, that you have been leaving locked because you did not know how to open it? Walt had the ironwork. Delores had the panels. They had each other, and they had 47 years of knowing how to do hard things together, and they went to a county auction, and they paid $600, and they opened a padlocked gate. What is your padlocked gate? Thank you for spending this time with Walt and Delores and with this channel. The next story is already waiting. I think you are going to want to hear it.